When you think about AI security, what comes to mind? Probably some super sophisticated hacker breaking into a complex system, right? Well, what if the entire security field has been preparing for the wrong kind of fight?
So, today we're giving AI security a much needed reality check. We're going to dig into this fascinating and honestly kind of huge gap between the attacks that researchers study in the lab and the real threats that AI systems are actually facing out in the wild. Here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll talk about the security gap. Then, we'll meet the theoretical super attacker that most academics are worried about. After that, we'll see how a huge survey puts that whole theory to the test. We'll bust a couple of major myths, and then wrap up with how we can build smarter, more realistic defenses. Okay, let's get right to the heart of it, the AI security gap. This is all about the surprising and, frankly, pretty concerning mismatch between the threats researchers are studying in theory and what's actually happening in practice. You see, for years now, brilliant researchers have been dreaming up incredibly powerful ways to attack AI models. I mean, they've shown they can poison them, steal their secrets, and completely fool them. But that leads to the billion-dollar question. Does any of this stuff actually work outside of a controlled lab environment? So, to really get this gap, we first have to meet the imaginary villain of most research papers. Let's call him the academic super attacker. Now, this isn't a real person, but a concept that researchers call a threat model. So, what the heck is a threat model? Well, think of it like a profile of your enemy. It defines everything about a potential attacker. What do they know? What tools can they use? What's their ultimate goal? It's basically the rule book for how the good guys and bad guys are going to play the game. And this is where it gets really interesting. The typical attacker in a research paper, they're basically a supervillain. They're often assumed to have access to the model's training data, maybe even its source code. They can change that data and they can ping the AI with just thousands and thousands of questions to find its weaknesses. A true super attacker. But is that realistic at all? Well, to find out, a team of researchers decided it was time for a reality check, and they went straight to the source, the people who are actually building and deploying AI every single day. And get this, they didn't just ask a few people. Nope. They surveyed 271 AI practitioners. We're talking data scientists, engineers, developers from companies all over the world. That gives these findings some serious credibility. The whole point of the survey was simple but brilliant. Find out if the super attacker from the lab actually exists in the real world. What can a real attacker actually see and do? Let me tell you, the answers were not what anybody was expecting. All right, let's dive into the first big bombshell from this survey. It's all about something called poisoning attacks. This is the idea that an attacker can corrupt an AI by messing with the very data it learns from. So, in theory, researchers assume an attacker can just waltz in and change a big chunk of a model's training data. But the survey found that, in reality, a company's private training data is under some serious lock and key. Getting direct access is, well, it's pretty much unheard of. How rare are we talking? This number really says it all. A whopping 71.6% of practitioners said their training data was just flat out not accessible to any third party, period. And you can see that disconnect so clearly right here. The academic attacks often assume an attacker can poison 10, 20, even 30% of the training data. But in the real world, the survey found that if any data is accessible at all, which usually means it's public data, it's almost always less than 10%. So the research is focusing on a scenario that barely ever happens. The researchers who wrote the paper summed it up perfectly. They said, scientific threat models tend to be too generous. They give the attacker these superpowers that they just don't have in most real-world situations. But hold on, here's the twist. While direct poisoning is rare, a totally new and seriously understudied threat is popping up. Almost half of practitioners, 48.1%, are using pre-trained models from other companies and then just fine-tuning them. So an attacker could poison that original model, creating a kind of Trojan horse that companies then willingly bring right inside their own walls. Yikes. So that covers the training phase. But what about once a model is live and out in the world? Well, that brings us to the second huge finding, what the paper calls the query conundrum. A lot of attacks, like stealing a model's design or triching its filters, rely on being able to ask the AI tons and tons of questions, or queries, to find its weak spots. The theory assumes an attacker gets thousands of tries. The reality? It's pretty much all or nothing. Just look at this chart from the survey. It's fascinating. You can see the reality is all about the extremes. The biggest chunk, over a third, shows that many models allow no outside queries at all. Then you have these two other big groups, one that allows very few queries, less than 100, and another that allows a totally unlimited number. That middle ground is surprisingly tiny.
And here is the absolute kicker. That middle ground, where an attacker can make a few thousand queries, the exact scenario that most academic research has focused on for years, it's one of the absolute least common situations in the real world. We've been studying the exception, not the rule.
So, after all that, what do we do? Look, the point here isn't to trash past research. Not at all. It's about using these incredible real-world insights to build way better and way more practical defenses for the future.
And the paper lays out a really clear roadmap. Researchers should start focusing on attacks that use only tiny amounts of poisoned public data. They absolutely need to dig into the security risks of using those third-party models we talked about. And for query attacks, the focus needs to shift to the extremes, attacks that work with fewer than 100 questions, and defenses for systems that give attackers unlimited tries. You know, at the end of the day, this reality check is just so valuable. It helps bridge that gap between the academic world and what's happening on the ground. By focusing our brainpower on the threats that companies are actually facing, we can make the AI systems we all depend on safer and more secure.
And that leaves us with one final and really critical question. As AI becomes a bigger and bigger part of our lives, in our hospitals, our banks, everywhere, this research forces us all to ask, are we building the right locks? And more importantly, are we even putting them on the right doors?